Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your patience. For folks that are in the room and online, we were having some technology issues. We're actually still having some technology issues. It's great to have all of these options that we have nowadays, but sometimes they just don't want to cooperate. But we are glad to be here. We're glad you are here. We're glad you're online. This is Intersections, which is a project of Interfaith Alliance of Iowa, and that's Interfaith Alliance of Iowa. And I'm Connie Ryan. I'm the Executive Director of Interfaith Alliance. So thank you for being here. This is actually our last Intersections of the season. So we take off the summer months, and there's a planning group that will start working on next year's season, and they'll start meeting next week. There's a group of about 5 or 6 folks who have been part of that work. And if you want to be part of that work and want to be part of the planning, just let me know, and I will add you. We're going to do that by June, starting next Tuesday. And the planning group comes with ideas for intersections and speaker ideas, topic ideas, and then helps to invite folks, those speakers, to be part of intersections. So if you're interested in being part of that effort, do let me know, and we would love to have you. So today we are going to talk about women's rights and women's bodies, Christian conservatives, and the ongoing battle over female autonomy. It is a very timely subject in the state of Iowa as we have the issue going before our Supreme Court, the Iowa Supreme Court, and as well as the legislature that's finishing its work and its efforts and its chaos. So anyway, so we're delighted to have Dr. Peter Jauhiainen.
Close enough.
He talks me every time, and I mess it up every time. So, is a professor of religion at Kirkwood Community College, where he has taught for 30 years. He specializes in American religious history and has a keen interest in the study of religious political rights, white Christian nationalism, religion and public education, and the intersection of religion and politics, right squarely in the middle of the work that Interfaith Alliance of Iowa does as well. Peter has a PhD in the University of Iowa and an MDiv for Princeton Theological Seminary. So won't you welcome the professor?
Thank you. Good to be here with you. I'm a historian by trade, so I want to start out by giving a little bit of a history lesson, and then I'll be reflecting on the Dobbs decision of the last, over the last couple of years here. And I should start out by, let's see, I want to make sure I'm getting this. Okay. For my historical backdrop, I'm drawing from a wonderful work by R. Marie Griffith, Moral Combat, How Sex Divided American Christians and Fractured American Politics. She's a professor at Wash U in St. Louis. Well, conflicts over sexuality have had a long history in America. Americans have had a preoccupation, a religious preoccupation. I'm not going to get this clicker. There we go. The common assumption through the mid-20th century was that Christian morality would form the basis of U.S. laws and politics, that Christians, especially white Protestants, they played a dominant role in American life, in debates over morality, sexual behavior, and gender roles. Up through the end of the 19th century, most took it for granted that there was a kind of natural, biological, divinely created sexual order. This sexual order basically said that men should be the heads of the households, that wives were to submit to their husband's authority, and that monogamous heterosexual marriage was the only sanctioned site for sexual relations. Now, the implications of this were that gender roles were tied to biology. They were tied to sex. And there were certain social and cultural expectations that were associated with this. Men and women were to have different public and domestic roles and activities. By implication, then, if you were an independent woman, or if you were homosexual or transgendered, or promiscuous, you were seen as a threat to the social order. Scholars have talked about this time period in the late 19th century as a time in which Americans emphasized this cult of true womanhood, where women's roles as mothers was prominently featured. Women were seen to be naturally suited to preside over the home, and the home was the location of child rearing, of nurture, and the like. As we get into the 20th century, there were fissures to this traditional sexual order that began to emerge. And debates over sex can be characterized broadly as a conflict between change and tradition. Traditionalists and conservatives basically were opposed to changes to norms regulating sex and gender, whereas progressives or liberals were increasingly open to changes that expanded access to power and influence for persons who were once excluded, marginalized, or stigmatized for behaving outside the norm. And this mirrored the conflict over, the modernist conflicts over how to interpret the Bible and other kinds of religious standards as well. Over time, the relation between biological sex and the social roles ascribed to men and women were increasingly contested. One of the ironies of the cult of true womanhood was that women in the late 19th century used their newfound moral status to defend their rights to get outside the home, to engage in social reform, to protect the home, and in order to truly protect the home, they advocated for the right to suffrage, for the right to vote, for the right to engage in politics. This is one of these rich historical ironies. So in 1919, the 19th Amendment was passed, granting women equal voting rights. But during this time, of course, many feared the specter of changing women. They thought that women gaining the right to vote would lead to the destruction of home life. It would threaten their sacred roles as mothers, to which women were supposed to have been born. In 1905, the former President Grover Cleveland, in an editorial in Ladies' Home Journal, worried about suffrages, and I quote, dangerous undermining effects on the characters of the wives and mothers of our land. The achievement of national suffrage for women also took place within a larger ethos of freer sexual expression and challenges to gender hierarchies. More women donned short flapper dresses and bobbed their hair, and in other ways flaunted their disdain for the Victorian morality embedded in social norms and the law. Right around this time, Margaret Sanger became a signature leader of the birth control movement. She saw the brutal costs of childbearing that they could impose upon women in Lower Manhattan. She worked as a nurse and midwife in Lower Manhattan. She encountered women who had been raped by their own fathers, where improvised abortions were rampant, and babies often died from neglect. For Margaret Sanger, the right to birth control was an essential instrument for women's freedom. And during the 1920s, support for contraceptive use spread widely. Now, this triggered a reaction. There were people who were trying to curtail this movement. But by 1938, there was a poll in the Ladies' Home Journal which indicated that 79% of American women approved of contraception. There was a Gallup poll of 1940 that indicated between 70 and 80% of all Americans favored the distribution of birth control information to married persons by governmental clinics, right? So the movement for birth control kept spreading. During this time, Christians debated the morality of non-procreative sex within marriage. In other words, was it okay to enjoy sex other than for procreation? And a lot of religious conservatives feared this female sexual awakening, right? The notion that women might actually want sex, right, and enjoy sex was seen to be dangerous to society. They feared the specter of the sexually liberated female. The debate over sexual norms and reproduction was linked to larger questions. Larger questions about the debate over religious authority. What right do religious institutions have to impose their values on women and to try to control women? It was linked to a larger debate over the power of the state, a state that was often allied with religious institutions to control women's choices. Of course, it was also part of a larger cultural debate over female autonomy, as well as about the place of choice and pleasure, right? Should females have complete freedom of choice in this regard? During the post-World War II era, there was a kind of broad Christian consensus over what were considered to be normative views of sex and marriage, with strict sexual expectations and strict gender roles that kind of aligned with that kind of earlier hierarchy that I was talking about. But also after World War II, there were some bombshell reports that were published, the so-called Kinsey reports on sexual behavior. His study of men was published in 1948, his study of women in 1953. These were explosive reports, and it indicated that men and women were far more sexually adventurous than their decorous public norms permitted. These Kinsey reports kind of triggered a revolution within a lot of church people. They began to rethink what was considered to be normal sexual behavior. And they also triggered a sharp rise in open discussion and debate about sex, which pushed both liberal and conservative Christians into publicly staking out very diverse positions on the matter. Now, conservative clergy were upset. The Kinsey reports represented for them an attack on Christian civilization and an attack on American womanhood. Billy Graham even devoted one of his radio telecasts to denouncing the Kinsey reports. For Christian conservatives, the Kinsey reports threatened to overturn the gendered sexual roles and expectations that for them grounded godly civilization. They were especially alarmed by the second report on female activities, the idea that females were actually engaging in different kinds of, sexual practices beyond the kind of traditional missionary position, right? And this was very alarming to them. By the late 1950s and 1960s, this was a time of rapid changes in American attitudes regarding sex and gender. The trends uncovered by Kinsey only intensified as a broader culture, public culture, grew more tolerant of explicit sexual themes and imagery. Playboy magazine debuted in 1953, the same year as the Kinsey report on female sexual behavior. Hollywood films became a lot more overt in their treatment of sex. And now sexually frank novels were published more widely. Helen Gurley Brown's racy bestseller, Sex and the Single Girl of 1962, advocated for women's sexual freedom before and outside marriage. And then, of course, by 1960, the first birth control pill was approved by the FDA. During the 1960s, many college students were openly questioning the strict sexual standards and taboos of their parents, including disapproval of premarital sex. I suspect I have some of those former college students in my audience today. Shame on you. No, all right. Respect your parents. All right. So, you know, we often think of the sexual revolution as a kind of secularizing force, as a manifestation of the free love of the hippie culture. But I think it's also important to view the sexual religion as a revolution in religious thinking as well, about the moral norms related to sex and gender. Sex and sexuality were a battleground for competing visions of society. They were a battleground between notions of freedom and authority, between notions of individual autonomy and collective coercion, between notions of the rights of conscience and versus religious and political enforcement of traditional moral norms. Of course, at the epicenter of this struggle were women's freedom and women's rights. The 60s was also known for second-wave feminism. In the early 60s, Betty Friedan published her Feminine Mystique, where she criticized the view that a woman's role was to marry and bear children. Now, her ideas weren't revolutionary. There were other feminists before her who were publishing a lot of the same things, but she popularized so many of these ideas. This is a widely selling book, right? And so many more and more women were on board with these ideas. Of course, at the epicenter of this battle over women's rights was this movement to advance women's rights to have an abortion if they so choose. So the phrase pro-choice was chosen to highlight women's autonomy and personal moral decision-making. There were prominent Christian, progressive Christian leaders who made a moral case for abortion rights. And it was very important for them to counter the Catholic argument that, well, all life begins at conception, that the embryo is a living thing, entity, and that therefore abortion was considered to be murder. Progressive Christians began to make this ethical distinction between an embryo and a child, that there's a difference between an embryo and a child. And therefore, it is considered to be a moral act to expand women's access to medical termination of embryonic life, depending on the circumstances, right? Women living in a variety of different kinds of situations in which it might be the moral act to actually terminate the life of the embryo. So progressive Christians made the argument that we need to kind of focus on a commitment to those who are living, right? Living persons, full persons, rather than a commitment to embryonic life forms. Many of them also pointed out that the strongest opposition to abortion rights in the 60s and early 70s often came from people who were trying to defend a patriarchal worldview. Conservative Catholics and very conservative Protestants and fundamentalists. So the most staunch opponents were Roman Catholics and conservative Protestants. And they were defending religious rules that were tied into their gendered hierarchy and a sexual morality that kind of preserved the male domain, male rulership, right? That somehow male leadership was seen to be a kind of sacred cause for them. So a lot of progressives during this time were arguing that this isn't simply about abortion rights. This is about power. This is about asserting power over women, the power to restrict women's behavior and to control their status, to restrict their freedom. And women's groups at this time also argued that the state's enforcement of motherhood exemplified the oppression of women, that abortion access was critical to their full sexual liberation. How am I doing on time? Okay. And this led to then Roe versus Wade in 1973, this 7-2 ruling in which women were granted a constitutional right to abortion throughout the first 2 trimesters of their pregnancy. Of course, this triggered a reaction from a new movement, sometimes identified as the new religious right, the Christian right. Certain leaders like Jerry Falwell and Beverly LaHaye. Basically, Falwell argued that abortion and feminism in general threaten traditional family and American values. They seized upon this concept of family values in order to express their deep anxiety about what was happening during this time. The American family, according to them, was in crisis, and that we needed to then promote family values. But they were expressing a kind of sentiment. I mean, there was a crisis that was emerging in the 1970s, but by this time, fewer than half of married 2-parent households and fewer than a quarter of all American households conform to the traditional family value, conform to this model where you have a breadwinning husband going out and working, and a wife who's strictly residing within the home. So this, you could point to larger economic issues that led to this kind of dismantling of this kind of noble view of the family that they had at this time. Religious conservatives blamed moral permissiveness, feminists, and gay rights activists for subverting traditional family values, and that we needed to restore the traditional family, and a traditional family where male authority reigned supreme. I mean, Christian conservative social theory starts with male authority. It's rooted there in their interpretations of Genesis. It starts with male authority over the home. Tim LaHaye, another prominent evangelical pastor and has published numerous books, at one point said, women, if at all possible, should stay at home. When the wife works, it, quotes, I quote, breeds a feeling of independence and self-sufficiency which God did not intend a married woman to have, unquote. Of course, particularly threatening to them were aggressive women. They worried that men were losing their manliness and becoming feminized, and that women were competing with men in the marketplace, right? I can see some moans. Here's some. And single women and women who seek to avoid motherhood were especially seen as problems for some of the same reasons that I was talking about. There was a particular fear and loathing of so-called feminists in a lot of their literature during this time. So conservatives for the past 50 years have engaged in a long-term strategy to overturn Roe versus Wade, right? Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society are key principal players in this attempt to overturn Roe versus Wade. But surely a 50-year precedent would never be overturned, right? It's the settled law of the land, right? Most Americans simply assumed that this was settled, right? Then the Dobbs decision was handed down. We're in the two-year anniversary of the leaked opinion that yesterday was the 2-year anniversary here. Now it's interesting when you look at the Dobbs decision, which was authored by Justice Alito. He employed a similar logic that was used in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which essentially codified racial segregation. Right? Basically, this logic is that states may violate the individual rights of their residents in any way their legislatures deem reasonable. Right? And that in the future, the federal courts, the federal government should defer to these state legislatures, even when the laws at issue concern matters of great social significance and moral substance. Plessy versus Ferguson was a states' rights issue. Justice Alito's opinion basically affirms this: abortion should be a states' rights issue. The federal government, according to Alito and the majority opinion, has no legitimate role in protecting women from states that want to force women and girls to give birth. As a historian, what particularly caught my attention when I read this decision was this language, where Alito said, aside from rights specifically enumerated in the text of the Constitution, he claims to be an originalist, he argued only those rights deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition deserve its protections. Right? Only those rights deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions deserve its protection. Well, one thing is this opens the door, right? One of the implications of this legal reasoning, this opens the door to state coercion if conservatives are opposed to that freedom. The other thing is, it has serious implications for overturning the rights revolutions of the past 70 years. Actually, before I get to that, he said, unless it's deeply rooted in the nation's history and traditions, and he kind of selectively picks from history. He showed himself to actually be a bad historian. Whereas there are plenty of American historians who would point out to you that abortion was widely acknowledged in early American history upon, the restriction would be at the time of quickening, when you start feeling the fetal kick. But otherwise, it was widely accepted. And also, Justice Alito, in some of his footnotes, cited a British jurist from the 17th century, Sir Matthew Hale, who was the Chief Justice of England. And among other things, Sir Matthew Hale thought it was impossible for a husband to rape his wife because the wife was the property of the husband, right? So you're appealing to 17th century mindsets in order to affirm this decision. So how far back are you willing to go to say that something is deeply rooted in our tradition? So what are the implications for this? Roe versus Wade was based upon the due process clause of the 14th Amendment, right? That protects this right to privacy. It's not rooted, it's not literally in the Constitution, right? That there's this right to privacy. But the Supreme Court in 1973 said there is a right to privacy that's here in the 14th Amendment, right? That decision was based on a previous decision, Griswold versus Connecticut of 1965, which granted a Connecticut married couple the right to contraception, right, due to this right to privacy, right? 14th Amendment, due process, and some other appeals to the Bill of Rights. And some of the more recent cases, Loving versus Virginia, the right to have interracial marriage, Lawrence versus Texas, which struck down the sodomy laws that were aimed against homosexuals, Obergefell versus Hodges, which granted gay couples the right to marry. All of these are based upon this interpretation of the 14th Amendment that there's a basic right to privacy. You've got people like Justice Alito, Justice Thomas, and others who say that right to privacy is an error. Unless it's deeply rooted in our nation's history and traditions, this has a This is a threat to all the rights gained in the last 70 years. So there's a basic question at issue here. What does it mean to be free? Right? What does it really mean to be free? Does freedom include the right to define your own family? Does it include the freedom to marry whom you love? Does it include deciding how many children you want to have? Right? Making the decision, having a mother make a decision, you're in poverty, right? And I just can't feed another mouth, right? Does it include making medical decisions regarding your own body? What does it mean to be free? And what is the moral choice? What are the moral choices that we have, right, to make in so many of these situations? Is it moral to deny women medical care who show up at emergency rooms with unviable pregnancies? Is it moral to criminalize the actions of doctors who provide medically necessary procedures to protect the reproductive organs of women? Right? Is it moral to force raped and pregnant preteens to force them to have their babies? These are actual cases I'm citing, right? Of course, then, recently, the Alabama Supreme Court declared that embryos created through IVF are indeed children. So this begs another question. Is this a child? Is this a fully formed child? This is a 6-day-old blastocyst that's used in IVF treatments. Should this be granted the same kind of moral status as a newborn child? Right? And if you think the House, the GOP House of Representatives aren't going to work for a national abortion ban, or when they say that, well, we want to protect IVF, you should consider these bills that are being promoted here. The Life at Conception Act, which all members of our GOP House have endorsed, says that the right to life guaranteed by the Constitution is vested in each human being at all stages of life, including the moment of fertilization. Right? Is there going to be a ban on IVF in the near future? You may have heard about Project 2025, which is an extensive document, close to 900 pages, to try to remake the federal government, sponsored by the Heritage Foundation. One of the designs of this is to weaponize the federal government to attack abortion access. It includes rescinding FDA approval for the abortion pill, reviving the Comstock Act of 1873, which criminalized the dissemination of birth control through mail and across state lines. It includes also using the CDC for abortion surveillance and data collection. They want to establish a big national data bank and chronicle all pregnancies and abortions and miscarriages and the like. Right? Well, what could possibly go wrong with a national data bank? Right? What could possibly go wrong? Right? I could go on. I'm going to just end with a few more slides. Numerous states, since the Dobbs decision, something like 20-some states have passed more restrictive abortion laws. But every time this has come up to a vote for the people, these laws have been soundly defeated at the polls. Right? So the question is for us that we could even pursue here today, what does the future truly hold? So I will stop there and open up for questions.
As a proudly aggressive woman, I was. If you have questions, please raise your hand. I will bring you the microphone, and then catch my eye, and I'll know who to go to next. I'm going to start here, and then I'll go to the.
My question is about bodily autonomy as a whole. Like, I understand, like, you think that fetus is another person and that the woman has a responsibility to save that life. Do we do that in any other situation? If the baby needs a kidney, is the father required to give a kidney to that baby?
No.
If you need a blood transfusion, am I required to give you my blood because you need it? And then even further along in how we determine life later in life, you may say there's an electrical impulse in the heart, but there's no brain activity. So am I still allowed to take my grandmother off life support because she's got a heartbeat, but she has no brain activity? I mean, those are the kind of things that it just keeps snowballing into what we accept as our rights to our bodily autonomy and to make decisions about what we want done with our bodies. And is it all just because this is related to sex?
Well, I would say that this particular issue receives greater attention because this is why I wanted to give the long history, right? There is a history. I grew up within a conservative evangelical subculture, and I used to think, and there are well-meaning people who think that abortion is murder, right? And I was willing to acknowledge that, and these are sincerely held beliefs by people, right? But as I've studied the matter in a kind of broader scope, I start to realize this is part of a larger pattern within U.S. history of trying to control women's choices, right? And so this issue receives a lot of attention, especially from conservative groups that tend to be very patriarchal. And this is part of a larger pattern of other things that are going on in Southern Baptist Convention and other kinds of areas where women increasingly are being, their rights are being curtailed, their leadership positions are being eliminated. And I see this as another attempt to simply control their reproductive choices. And to encourage this idea of, well, your primary responsibility is to be a mother. So I see it as part of that larger pattern.
Please.
I served in a Calvary Church in Lamars, Iowa, pretty close to Orange City. The lady in our church was working with a domestic abuse line. They put the domestic abuse line in Orange County, in Orange City, and it rang off the wall. We were a conservative controlling group. Second question, we heard about it when the Attorney General first spoke out against paying for abortions. Has she finished her audit yet?
Never will.
Yeah, I haven't been following that one, but that'll be an ongoing thing.
Yeah.
The question that's really been bearing on my mind is how to speak about the aspect of abortion to people who are on the fence. It's really a theological question, and I'm not sure. I know that you have training in both areas, but I have actually heard well presented Christian facts that have been made by progressive Christians that support the woman's right or freedom to make choices of her own body. Some were biblical references, and some were perhaps more based on law. And I didn't have my notebook that day, and I didn't write them down. And I would really appreciate having those ideas at my fingertips to be able to talk to people, because there are, I think, many individuals who are willing to look at the issue from both ways. And if you present valid facts, that you're more likely to make an impression or be able to get your point across.
Mhm.
Thank you.
You know, you made a reference to like biblical references. I don't know of a single verse in the Bible that addresses abortion. Right. There's only one passage that comes remotely close to that, and that's in the Hebrew Torah, in which if there's a fight or something, and a pregnant woman is kicked and it causes her to lose her child, right? Then the penalty isn't it's not this person should be put to death because it's an eye for an eye. No, there's a compensation. There's like a monetary compensation that's to be paid for the loss of this child, right? And so for causing a miscarriage. So it was viewed as the property of the woman, right? But it's not an individual person that you've just murdered. Sometimes they'll try to quote passages about these kind of prophetic tropes about God calling Isaiah from birth or something, but that has nothing to do with the issue of abortion. It's kind of God's wisdom in calling forth prophets, right? So I don't know a single passage in the Bible that refers to abortion.
I think you're quoting from Exodus. I can't remember the chapter, 22 or 23. That's where that's from. My question is the definition of rape. If rape is the use of a person, it doesn't have to be female, of their body against their will, then why isn't forced pregnancy gestational rape?
That's a good question. Yeah. Oh, by the way, and I heard, I haven't followed up on this, but I think I was listening to NPR, where the Arizona repealed this, this 1864 law, right, abortion law. But apparently, the age of consent at that time for a girl was 10, right? So.
One of the best arguments I ever heard for being pro-choice came from a friend of mine who had been told midway through her pregnancy that she might have a child with multiple disorders due to cytomegalovirus. She decided at that point to keep the pregnancy. It badly affected her marriage, but she came out of it saying, if I hadn't had that choice, I don't know if I could have faced it. But being given the choice made it her decision and made her strong enough to know, this is something I can deal with, rather than being forced into it.
We have a question from online. What leverage do progressive faith organizations have to make religious freedom claims for reproductive justice?
What leverage do they have?
Mm-hmm.
The leverage is, I think, with the voters right now. I don't think they have a lot of leverage with state legislatures who are doing the bidding of national conservative foundations that are being funded by millionaires and billionaires who are writing these proposed bills that are being copied by state after state after state, right? They don't have leverage with the Heritage Foundation or Federalist Societies or some of these other conservative think tanks. They do have leverage with, so they don't have leverage with, I think, a lot of conservative legislators, unless they're in a district that's kind of purplish, right? And then there's some leverage there, perhaps. But we see that in polling, I think there's only about 5 states right now where the majority are in support of these restrictive abortion laws. The vast majority of American people, something like 67, 70% of Americans, do not favor all of these restrictive abortion laws, right? And yet you still have now legislatures, very conservative legislatures in at least 20 states that are imposing their will on the people, right? So we're seeing a breakdown of some representative democracy here due to the influence of these national think tanks that are being well funded, and due to the influence of a bought and paid for Supreme Court, right? So the leverage is to work with the American people to to keep voting. If you don't like what's happening at the state level, you just start voting your representatives out.
Question here. So we have folks getting all fetus fetish about the embryo, but then once it becomes a child, we don't feed them. How do we speak to that ugliness without, in a reasoned way to help point out that discrepancy and how we support the child once it's born versus denying perhaps not even having this child in the first place? I think isn't it interesting that a fetus is a political tool and a weapon?
Yeah. I would agree, progressives have been making that case for the last 50 years, that you need to support the life of the child once they're born. And there are progressive conservative evangelicals who have made that case as well, to try to have a kind of consistent pro-life position. It tends to fall on deaf ears to a lot of other conservatives.
I was fascinated to see that there's a new trend on TikTok. Has anybody seen this? Where it's a millennial women are some of them, obviously, some of the kind of the lead voices in some of these movements are going to the 1950s, and they're aprons, and they're doing their hair, and they're dropping out of things. And I'm a stay-at-home mom, and I have been forever, so I know there's always a tension between people who work and people who have children and people who have both and neither and whatever. And so it's fascinating because what some of these women are saying, it's very biblical, very patriarchal, but their point is that they tried to do the rat race, and it's easier to be this 1950s idealized, submissive wife, and as long as you just kind of submit, it's such an easier life. And one of the things that is an argument, obviously, is that you don't know some of the other things of why this was not a healthy lifestyle for a lot of people. And I just find it fascinating that this is coming out, and it's an influential trend right now, because women are tired. And I think that's one of the things is when people give up, it's easier to go back to a tradition. And I just wondered perceptions on that.
Yeah. Well, that was, Phyllis Schlafly, who played a major role in undermining the ERA in the 1970s. That was one of her arguments, that if you pass the Equal Rights Amendment, then women are going to be working out in the workplace, and this is an easier life for them, right? Well, by the 1970s, that model of the old nuclear family was destroyed, and there were plenty of women who had to work in order to make ends meet for their families. But that's an argument that's often made by very comfortable middle to upper class women.
I just wanted to note that the Iowa voters are kind of hemmed in by the legislature because we have no method for doing a referendum. So in order to change the Constitution in Iowa, it has to be a resolution by two separate sessions of the House and Senate. Then it would go to people, because you have to get them to do that first.
Mhm. No.
I'm baffled about why this is so hard. We aren't starting from scratch and not knowing how it's going to turn out. All we have to do is look around the world, and there are all kinds of different models of how it works out. Right now in Afghanistan, women have no rights at all, and they are committing suicide because of young girls are being forced into marriage because their families can't take care of them and they don't have a future. You can see how that works out. And on the question about the definition of rape, well, Europe is working on that right now. They're actually legislating yes means yes. And this is something that is actually passing in their legislatures. You have to get stuff on the books or you can't prosecute it. Domestic violence is not a crime in many countries because it isn't on the books as a crime. So we need to get our books lined up, and we also need to take a look around the world and see what happens when too many rights are restricted.
You're in there. It's been perfect. What is the Supreme Court going to do, and what are we going to do if they get it wrong?
What's it?
Iowa Supreme Court, what are we gonna do? It's the case, the seafood ban that is on, before the Iowa Supreme Court, so.
So what's it going to do?
What do you think the Supreme Court will rule, and if they get it wrong, what's the strategy?
I don't know. I haven't followed that particular case very closely. So what is the Iowa Supreme Court going to do? I don't have good, I wouldn't have a good basis to answer that question.
My mind is going back to the minority, it seems the minority ruling. I saw a very interesting tape, I guess, recording put out by Mother Jones right after the 2020 election that was not stolen. The Heritage Foundation, which has already been mentioned, they immediately put together legislation, like you had said. They write the legislation, not the legislatures. And then because it was COVID, they put it up on a Zoom call to train the Republican majority states, like Iowa. Iowa was the first one. They were the guinea pig. And it passed with flying colors. And but anyway, on this Zoom call through Heritage, they were teaching these legislatures leaders how to pass the bill for voter suppression, we'll call it. And they told the people, the trainers told the people, be sure you make it look like you wrote it. That is how you are going to sell it to your voters. And then they used Iowa as an example on this Zoom call by the trainers. They said, we submitted it to Iowa, they did it first, and it passed with flying colors. So now the rest of you get to work. So the way for them to treat us like cattle, or maybe worse than cattle, is to suppress the vote. They can't win with a fair and free election, so now Plan B is to suppress the vote as to who can vote, which I think is all part of women's rights. I mean, that will go too, by the wayside too, back to the Arizona days, that rule, that law was made when we couldn't vote. So anyway, I just wanted to throw out voter suppression and the funding behind it.
Yeah, the voter suppression, the gerrymandered districts, it's all to prepare for minority rule in you know, whether it's nationwide or certainly certain states. Right?
And, you know, it's a lack of factual information, you know. Peter, you showed the blastocytes and, you know, the distinction between brain activity and an electrical activity in the heart. And I'll always remember the Missouri senator who claimed that if it was a legitimate rape, a woman's body would produce chemicals to expel it. And recently heard a young woman who had been raised in a conservative household who literally believed that men had one less rib than women because God created women out of Adam's rib. And so it's not an issue of knowledge. They don't want knowledge. It's all about power.
And on that note, I think we will end and please help me to thank Dr. Peter Jauhiainen. We continue to have technical problems today, so I'm going to borrow Peter's microphone so we can hear online as well. Actually, you can have that. I'll just do that. So there's a couple of resources. On interfaithallianceofiowa.org website, there is a conversation guide resource that some faith leaders put together last year. So if you're part of a small group, if you're part of a house of worship, it can be used secularly. It is certainly clergy driven, so you can navigate it yourself. But if you go to interfaithallianceofiowa.org, in one of the drop downs, you will find that resource. That may help some who want to have this continued conversations in your own communities. It is designed for houses of worship, but it can be used in other ways. So I just leave that to you for your consideration. To the question about the Supreme Court, the decision we believe will come down in June. And my answer to your question, similar to what Peter talked about in other places, is the response, if it is the wrong decision in our view, is November. There are other things that could happen in between, but it is November. If you care about these issues, and we are a nonpartisan organization, we care about the issues and we care about the impact on people. And so we have to have legislators and lawmakers who care about those issues also and have an impact that way. And as Representative Art Stade would say, he would love some colleagues that also care about these issues also. So a lot of them. So I just leave that with you as well. On your table is a flyer. We just printed a few of them, so take it if you want. We have Heather Cox Richardson as our featured guest speaker at the award celebration on June 6th, which is in Des Moines. But I know some of you know how to drive, and you know that I-80 takes you all the way to Des Moines. And I know some of you are actually attending, so we are delighted to have folks from Cedar Rapids join us. It is our biggest fundraiser of the year, and we would love to have you be with us. It is only in person, sorry. So we don't have to worry about technology issues. No, that's not why, but we would love to have you attend. I will tell you that if you want to be in the room and be part of that and hear Heather Cox Richardson, you'll want to make a reservation soon. We are nearly full. And so, which is exciting, and but we would love to have you with us. So please consider that, and if you're able to join us, make your reservation online. So thank you again, Peter. Very much appreciate all of your work and being with us today. And thank you, everyone. We will not be back here until September. So if you want to be part of the planning group, do let me know, and I'll add you to that Zoom. It's next Tuesday afternoon. So thank you all. Have a great weekend.